They are trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and quietly hand China the keys to the global oil market. That is the sentence they do not want to put on the front page, because the headline they want is simple: deal close, ceasefire extended, shipping restored, oil markets relieved. But that headline hides the transfer. And in the next 25 minutes, I am going to show you what was transferred, who received it, and why the bill may land inside your own house before winter. I have been tracking this Iran war update across wire services, shipping data, energy forecasts, financial notes, and global payment systems since February 28th. Not the television version, the settlement version. The version that moves after the missiles stop. I pulled the Reuters and Axios reporting on the draft memorandum. I pulled the Atlantic Council data on CIPS, pronounced CIPS. I checked the South China Morning Post record settlement numbers. I checked Deutsche Bank research on the Petrodollar. I checked Resolution Foundation and Ofgem, pronounced Ofgem, on the UK energy shock. And when you put all of those pieces together, the picture changes completely. The deal is not the end of a war. It is the beginning of a new payment order. That sounds dramatic. It is not. It is mechanical. Money moves through pipes. Oil moves through water. Power moves through whoever controls both. And right now, China is closer to controlling both than most people realize. The official story begins on May 24th. Reuters, citing Axios, reported that the United States and Iran were close to a 60-day ceasefire extension. During that period, the strait would reopen. Iran would clear the mines it had placed. Ships would move freely. Iran would be able to sell oil. And nuclear talks would begin under a temporary framework. That is the public shape of the deal, the diplomatic shape, the story designed for markets. Because markets like one thing more than victory. They like certainty. So when the word deal appeared, oil traders tried to exhale. Politicians exhaled. News anchors exhaled. And the official narrative wrote itself. America forced Iran to the table. Iran backed down. The shipping lane would reopen. The crisis would be over. But listen carefully to the language coming from Tehran. Iranian negotiator Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Mamad Bagher Ghalibaf, was not speaking like a man who had been defeated. He warned that Iran had rebuilt during the ceasefire. He warned that if war resumed, it would be more crushing and bitter for America than the first day. That is not surrender language. That is preparation language. That is a country saying, we used the pause. And here is the part most people missed. A ceasefire does not only stop missiles. A ceasefire gives systems time to adjust. Banks adjust. Shipping insurers adjust. Refiners adjust. Energy buyers adjust. Central banks adjust. And while television was asking whether the war was over, the real question was much quieter. What changed while the war was happening? If you have not subscribed yet, hit subscribe now. I post one of these every single day. Before I get to the geopolitics, I want to give you a number. Hold on to it. I'll come back to it, and when I do, it will change how you think about your energy bill this October. Hold that number. Not because it is the biggest number in this story. It is not. The biggest number is $178.5 billion. But 500 pounds is the number that brings the war home. Now look at what the Iran war news cycle missed. Every major outlet covered the strikes. Every major outlet covered the ceasefire talks. Every major outlet covered enrichment, missiles, sanctions, and the diplomatic language around nuclear weapons. Very few covered the payment system, and that is the mistake. Because the most important weapon in this story was not a missile. It was an invoice. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, is often described as China's alternative to SWIFT. That description is useful, but it is incomplete. SWIFT is the messaging layer. CIPS is a settlement layer for renminbi transactions. In plain English, it is part of the plumbing that lets cross-border money move in Chinese currency. For years, that sounded technical. For years, it sounded boring. For years, most people ignored it. Then March arrived. The South China Morning Post reported that CIPS processed a single-day record of 1.22 trillion yuan, roughly $178.5 billion, nearly 42,000 transactions. The system's average daily transaction value in March climbed to 920.45 billion yuan. That was the highest level in a year, and it was almost 50% higher than February. The Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center saw the same pattern from another angle. Daily volumes had usually been sitting between $85 and $105 billion. Then, in mid to late March, the numbers moved above $130 billion. That does not prove every payment was Iranian oil. The Atlantic Council was careful about that. And it matters to be careful. But it does prove something else. It proves that the settlement capacity was there. It proves that the system could absorb far larger flows. It proves that when the Middle East became unstable, demand for yuan settlement did not shrink. It accelerated. That is the hidden story. Not one oil shipment, not one bank account. The system itself is learning to move under pressure. And when payment systems learn under pressure, the world after the crisis is not the same as the world before it. This is where US dollar dominance starts to look different. For decades, people treated the dollar as if it were gravity. Always there, always necessary, always the unit through which serious trade must pass. But gravity does not need enforcement. The dollar system does. It needs banks. It needs sanctions. It needs correspondent accounts. It needs energy sellers willing to invoice in dollars. It needs energy buyers willing to hold dollars. It needs surplus oil money flowing back into American assets. That was the architecture. And architecture can be changed. Slowly, quietly, then suddenly. The Strait of Hormuz crisis did not simply create an oil shock. It created a live test of who could keep trading when the old pipes became politically dangerous. That is why China matters here. China did not need to win a naval battle. It needed to show that there is another pipe, a pipe outside Washington's immediate reach, a pipe that can handle energy-linked flows, a pipe that gives sanctioned states, cautious Gulf states, and anxious importers a second option. One option is not enough to end an empire, but it is enough to make every exporter ask a new question. If the dollar is expensive politically, why must it be mandatory financially? And once that question enters a finance ministry, it does not leave. It gets modeled. It gets stress tested. It gets discussed with banks. It gets placed inside contingency planning. That is how the optional becomes strategic. But one working option is enough to change the negotiation. That is the part nobody on television wants to sit with. The dollar does not have to disappear for American power to weaken. It only has to become optional. Everything I've just told you, that is the official story. America bombed Iran. Iran agreed to a deal. The strait reopens. Oil prices fall. Here is what actually happened. China won. Not in the way people understand winning. Not with aircraft carriers. Not with troops. Not with a victory speech. China won by watching America spend military capital while Beijing expanded financial optionality. That is the phrase. Financial optionality. It means other countries can choose. They can choose how to settle. They can choose which rails to use. They can choose how exposed they want to be to dollar enforcement. They can choose how much of their oil trade must pass through American financial permission. And once that choice exists, the old system becomes weaker, even if most countries keep using it. Because from that moment, Washington is no longer the only door. According to Open the Magazine, citing energy flow data, 11.7 million barrels of Iranian crude moved from Iranian ports to Chinese refineries after February 28th. That figure matters because it is not abstract. It is barrels. Ships, routes, refineries, discounts, settlement channels, contracts, a barrel of oil nobody in the Western press has identified yet. One move that, if made in the next 60 days, makes everything I am telling you permanent and irreversible. I'll tell you exactly what it is and when I expect it to happen. Hold that, because before I name the move, you need to understand the old machine. Petrodollar explained without the mythology. In the 1970s, after the United States broke the dollar's link to gold, Washington needed another anchor. Gold was gone. The Vietnam shock had damaged confidence. Inflation was rising. Oil had become the central commodity of modern life. So the United States built a new loop. Saudi Arabia would price oil in dollars. Other producers would follow. Oil buyers around the world would need dollars. Oil exporters would receive dollars. Those surplus dollars would flow back into American assets, especially U.S. Treasury bonds. The United States would get permanent demand for its currency. It would get cheaper borrowing. It would get deeper capital markets, and it would gain a financial surveillance position over the world's most important commodity. That was the loop. Oil to dollars. Dollars to treasuries. Treasuries to American borrowing power. American power back to Gulf security. Round and round. For 50 years, that loop did not just support the dollar. It supported the American model of global influence. Because if the world needs your currency to buy energy, the world has to hold your currency. And if the world holds your currency, you can borrow more cheaply, sanction more effectively, and absorb shocks that would break other countries. That is the real privilege. Not that America can print money without consequence. That is too simplistic. The real privilege is that global trade creates constant outside demand for the thing America issues. That privilege does not vanish overnight, but it can be eroded. And erosion is the right word. Because erosion is slow until the structure gives way. Deutsche Bank research published a note by Malika Sakhdeva on March 24th. The title alone tells you why it matters. What Iran means for the dollar. A perfect storm for the petrodollar. This is not a fringe blog. This is Deutsche Bank. The note says the long-term legacy of the Iran conflict could be the way it tests the foundations of the petrodollar regime. That is polite banking language. Translated, it means this. The war may be remembered less for what it did to Iran and more for what it revealed about the dollar. And what it revealed is uncomfortable. The system still dominates, but it is no longer uncontested. The Middle East is no longer only a military theater. It is a settlement theater, a currency theater, a reserve management theater, a place where oil, sanctions, payment systems, and security guarantees all collide. That is why this story is bigger than one ceasefire. The ceasefire can hold or fail. The nuclear talks can progress or collapse. Oil can rise or fall this week. But once countries see that alternative settlement routes can work under pressure, they do not forget that lesson. The invoices were decisive. The bombs were visible. That is the line. The bombs were visible. The invoices were decisive. Now bring this back to China. China is the largest energy importer in the world. It does not want its energy security permanently dependent on a currency controlled by its main rival. It does not want every crisis in the Gulf to become a dollar shortage problem. It does not want its suppliers to fear American sanctions more than they value Chinese demand. So, Beijing has been building around the problem, not charging straight at it, building around it. More yuan settlement, more bilateral trade, more clearing banks, more commodity contracts, more CIPS participants, more regional infrastructure, more reason for producers to say yes. And the Iran crisis gave China a perfect argument. If you want to sell into the largest demand market on earth, you need a payment route that survives American pressure. China can now say, we have one. Not perfect, not dominant, not global like the dollar, but real. And real is enough. Because in statecraft, a real alternative changes everyone's calculation. That is why the emotional peak of this story is not a missile strike. It is a banking chart. It is a spike in settlement volume. It is a refinery receiving crude. It is a Gulf bank asking whether the future is still only dollar denominated. It is Saudi Arabia watching carefully, because Riyadh understands the signal better than anyone. If the original oil dollar partner begins to hedge, the market will not hear a technical adjustment. It will hear permission. Permission for others to hedge. Permission for smaller producers to experiment. Permission for importers to ask for discounts in exchange for yuan settlement. Permission for central banks to hold a little less dollar exposure than before. That is why Saudi silence is not neutral. It is active waiting. And that is where this becomes personal. Let me stop the analysis for a moment and speak to you directly as someone who pays an energy bill, has savings in a UK bank, or has a mortgage coming up for renewal. I want you to stop for a moment and really think about this. That number I mentioned at the start, here it is, 500. That is what the Resolution Foundation says you could be paying extra every single year, not a one-off, every year. And the October price cap review hasn't happened yet. This is not a distant story. It is not only about Iran. It is not only about China. It is not only about America. It is about the price system that reaches into your home. Reuters reported on May 27th that British households will face energy bills averaging £1,862 a year from July. That is after Ofgem raised the price cap by 13%. The increase is about £221 above the previous cap. Ofgem blamed higher wholesale gas prices driven by the Middle East conflict. Reuters also reported that wholesale British gas prices were around 45% higher than before the United States began military action against Iran on February 28th. That is the bridge. Missiles there. Bills here. Shipping disruption there. Wholesale prices here. Payment systems there. Inflation here. This is the oil crisis arriving through your direct debit. This is how a global shock enters ordinary life, not as a headline, as a direct debit, as a smaller shop, as a colder room, as a canceled purchase, as a mortgage calculation that suddenly looks tighter. Resolution Foundation warned in March that sustained rises in oil and gas could add around 1 percentage point to inflation and £500 to typical annual energy bills. That is the number, £500. For many households, that is not an inconvenience. That is a month of food, a car repair, a school uniform budget, a winter cushion, a debt payment, a decision between heating properly and cutting somewhere else. And here is the cruel part. When the news says the strait is reopening, people assume the problem ends. But energy pricing does not work like a light switch. The July cap reflects wholesale costs already feeding through. The October forecast matters because it captures what the market believes next. Cornwall Insight, cited by Reuters, expects the cap to rise further in October if tensions remain unresolved. That means the summer can hide the pain. Lower usage makes the bill feel manageable. Then autumn arrives. Heating returns. Standing charges remain. Unit rates matter. And the household discovers that the war did not end when the headline changed. It moved from the screen to the meter. This is why the personal impact section matters. A normal foreign policy channel will stop at the map. A normal finance channel will stop at the chart. But the real world does not separate maps and bills. The shipping lane affects Leng flows. Leng flows affect wholesale gas. Wholesale gas affects Ofgem's cap. Ofgem's cap affects your household. Your household cuts spending. Lower spending affects the economy. The economy affects interest rates. Interest rates affect mortgages. Mortgages affects politics. Politics affects foreign policy. Round and round. That is the loop people are missing. So watch the right signals. Do not only watch whether a minister smiles at a press conference. Do not only watch whether oil is down for one trading day. Do not only watch whether a ceasefire headline sounds optimistic. Watch the October Ofgem review. Watch Brent. Watch European gas. Watch yuan crude futures volume in Shanghai. Watch CIPS data. Watch Gulf Bank statements. And most importantly, watch Saudi Arabia. Because now we can resolve the second loop. That move I told you to watch for, here it is. Watch Saudi Arabia. Not Iran, not China, Saudi Arabia. This is the whole game. Iran selling oil outside the dollar matters, but Iran is sanctioned. China buying oil in yuan matters, but China is the buyer. Russia using non-dollar settlement matters, but Russia is already outside much of the Western system. Saudi Arabia is different. Saudi Arabia is the original pillar, the central psychological anchor, the country that made the dollar oil security loop global. If Saudi Arabia signals that even a portion of its oil can be settled in yuan, the market will understand immediately. The petrodollar architecture does not need to collapse the next morning. It does not need a dramatic press conference. It does not need a flag being lowered. It only needs a precedent. Because once the original pillar becomes flexible, everyone else gets permission to become flexible. That is how systems end. First, the exception, then the option, then the habit, then the new normal. The Strait of Hormuz deal may become the trigger because it creates a temporary window. 60 days, enough time for markets to calm, enough time for diplomats to talk, enough time for Gulf states to reassess risk, enough time for China to push quietly, enough time for Saudi Arabia to send a signal without calling it a revolution. And the signal may not sound dramatic. That is important. Do not wait for a headline that says the petrodollar is dead. That headline will come years late. The real signal will be softer. Saudi Arabia welcomes settlement diversification. Saudi Arabia studies local currency energy trade. Saudi Aramco expands yuan-linked contracts. A Chinese bank deepens Gulf clearing operations. A joint statement mentions financial cooperation. A pilot transaction is announced. A portion of oil trade is settled in renminbi. That is what you watch, not the theater, the wording. My call is this. Within the 60-day ceasefire extension, at least one major Gulf producer publicly signals yuan acceptance for oil settlement. By the end of July 2026, watch for that sentence. Maybe wrapped in diplomatic language. Maybe hidden inside a broader China Gulf announcement. Maybe described as diversification, but the meaning will be clear. The old loop is no longer sacred. And once that happens, America faces a problem it cannot bomb. You cannot bomb a settlement preference. You cannot sanction every buyer. You cannot force every exporter to ignore its largest customer. You cannot rebuild monopoly once optionality has become normal. This is why the next phase will not look like a war. It will look like paperwork, commodity contracts, clearing arrangements, bilateral statements, central bank swap lines, exchange-traded futures, shipping insurance language, treasury reserve allocations. Most viewers will miss it because it will be boring, but boring is where power lives. The British Empire did not run only on flags. It ran on shipping insurance, banks, cables, and trade law. The American order did not run only on aircraft carriers. It ran on dollars, treasuries, SWIFT, oil pricing, and security guarantees. The Chinese challenge will not run only on ships. It will run on settlement rails, industrial demand, commodity leverage, and patient infrastructure. That is the real board, not the one on television, the financial board. And on that board, China just gained space. Save this. Screenshot it. Come back in 60 days. If Saudi Arabia moves, this was the moment the door opened. If Saudi Arabia does not move, watch the way. If the way does not move, watch the next CIPS spike. If CIPS does not spike, watch Shanghai crude futures. Because the direction is now visible. The only question is speed. That is the analysis. Now here is the part that stays with me. The public thinks wars end when the firing pauses. States know wars end when the new rules become accepted. And right now, the new rule being tested is simple. Oil does not have to mean dollars forever. That sentence is more dangerous than it sounds. Because if oil does not have to mean dollars forever, then the entire structure built around that assumption becomes negotiable. Treasury demand becomes negotiable. Sanctions power becomes negotiable. Gulf alignment becomes negotiable. Energy security becomes negotiable. The cost of American borrowing becomes negotiable. The price paid by European households becomes negotiable. Not instantly, not completely, but structurally. That is why this proposed deal matters. It is not peace. It is a pause during which everyone studies the new map. And the old map is still on television. The new map is already in the banking system. Drop your prediction in the comments. I read every single one. What does Saudi Arabia do in the next 60 days? And if you are right, I will say so in the next briefing. The briefing number 7 is linked right now. It connects directly to what I just showed you. Because this is not only about one conflict. It is about the system that prices your fuel, your mortgage, your savings, your currency, and your future. The side that controls settlement controls the aftermath. Remember that line. Because the next phase will not arrive with sirens. It will arrive as a contract, a bank notice, a clearing arrangement, a sentence in a joint statement, a currency line buried in the final paragraph. That is how the world changes when nobody is watching. The war you watched on your screen was not the war that was actually being fought.